Hey there, welcome back. And I'm here today with Neeshee Pandit. This is going to be one of the most interesting and one of the most controversial topics that we are going to discuss today. It's the transmission of almost everything from India to Greece and Greece to India. Not just Greece, but the other civilizations, except in Indian, like from India to Greece. So there is a basic idea that is going around in the world at this point of time. Especially, I think it's a bit too much now that astrology, especially, was transmitted from Greece to India, and people say that Yavana Jataka is the basic source of Indian astrology. But looking back, Yavana Jataka is not the basic source of Indian astrology, and there have been so many other forms of astrology, especially the Indian astrology has indigenously been nakshatra based astrology. So we might, there is also a conversation that's going around that horoscopic astrology was first introduced by Greeks in India. And there is so many other cultural, philosophical, and knowledge related transmission that happened between these two great civilizations before Common Era as well. It's not just after the Common Era, but before Common Era as well. So that's what we are basically going to touch up today and explore a bit. Welcome, Nishi. Thanks so much for doing this with me, and I'm sure this is going to be fun.
Yeah, thanks for having me, Aswin. This is definitely an interesting topic.
So this is the first time we are just meeting together. We have met in Carmina's channel, but this is the first time we are doing it individually. So would you like to just talk about your foray into astrology, and you're also specializing in Ayurveda. So I think it would be great to hear your story as well before we jump into the actual topic. So yeah.
Sure. I'm a Vedic astrologer, and before I was an astrologer, I studied Ayurveda, and I was an Ayurvedic practitioner, and I was seeing patients, and I got into astrology from medicine basically because I felt that I didn't have the full data that I needed when I was working with my patients, that there was more than meets the eye, you could say. And so I started looking into Jyotish because I knew that Ayurveda and Jyotish have been used together since ancient times. So I wanted to explore that more. And then I just got full blown into astrology. And so I combined the two. Now I do all my Ayurvedic consultations through astrology, but I also do, natal readings, yearly readings, all kinds of readings as well. So I basically try to approach everything through the lens of astrology.
Okay, that's great. I think that's one common point that we all have. And so I think, would you like to just explain a little bit about the course that you are doing with Ryan, like linking Ayurveda and astrology? I think that's one of the most fascinating things. I used to have a conversation with one of my friends, and Diana, her name is Diana from France, and she's also into Ayurveda and stuff. And I was also like always wondering, like, if I would ever other people who are if I would ever meet other people who are kind of linking both Ayurveda and astrology, because both of these traditions go back way too far, like into the past than we can actually imagine. So would you like to just shine some light on that?
Sure. I mean, astrology is the most ancient philosophical, religious paradigm of humankind, and medicine grows out of that science, basically. So it's really important for medicine to be rooted in astrological knowledge because that is its basis. So nowadays we have these two streams, but they really are one river, and we need to just go back to that because medicine can be improved by, going back to its roots, understanding astrology, and astrology can be improved as well when we understand medicine and the codified understanding of the human body and pathology and so forth that medicine articulated. So they're really, I see it as one science, and two very vast streams within that one science, So I'm very interested in connecting those two things. And also because I feel that one of the main imports for astrology is healing. I think astrology is very therapeutic, and I'm mostly interested in using it as a therapeutic tool, psychologically, medically. I think that's the reason people go to astrologers is because something is not right in their life. They're looking for something to be better. So I think that's really important to acknowledge that.
Sure. So, medical astrology, like medicine and astrology, I think it is a separate topic in itself, and I'm sure we'll be touching upon a little bit of that today as well, because when we venture far back into history, it's very difficult to ignore Ayurveda as well. So, let's just quickly jump on to our premise of what we are going to deal with today. So it's the introduction to Indian and European culture, like the Indo-European culture. I think, which is the actual starting point. Like, I'm not sure about when civilization started in Greece, but still civilization existed in India in the Indus Valley. Like, an Indus Valley civilization is the greatest evidence and proof for the fact that Indians had a very flourishing civilization even in like 4000 or 3000 BC. And even though people tend to call Ramayana and Mahabharata as epics, I think we actually venture even far back into the Treta Yuga and Dwapara Yuga, even before Kali Yuga. So people tend to call that as myth, but still, I think there is a lot of truth attached to it, and that is the area from where we have our basic philosophical and traditional understandings of our daily day-to-day life. So, how do you kind of picture the Indian civilization and Greek civilization? So, I don't know, but Babylonian civilization there is a Sumerians and stuff that exists from 5000 or 4000 BC. That's quite evident. But a Greek civilization, do you like to throw some light on the Indian Greek and the Indo-Greek confluence?
Sure. There's several things we have to note here. One is that the codification of knowledge, into texts is a later development in human culture. And so we can date texts. We usually consider that history begins with the first, textual evidence of it. So everything before what we have textual evidence for, we call prehistory. And we know that the Rig Veda is in fact the oldest, religious text, the oldest written, record of civilization, especially of a philosophical kind. And but that doesn't necessarily mean that that's when everything started, because that knowledge existed in an oral tradition long before it was written down, textually. So knowledge precedes its written record, basically, is the point I want to make. Sure. So when we're dating civilizations, historically we date them based on, when we have evidence of written record. But that's only relatively accurate, okay? Because those things existed long before they were codified. And the second point that I want to make is that this whole issue of, where did the knowledge originate from? And, did Greece give all their knowledge to India and that's where it's all coming from? Or is it the other way around, or somewhere in between? The root of that issue has everything to do with the understanding of what we call the Aryan civilization. This whole idea that was promoted by scholars like Max Muller and so forth, that there was basically, that the Aryans invaded India, that they were not native to India. Yeah. They were Europeans of some kind, basically. Yeah. And they are the ones who, established the Indus Valley civilization, on and on. That's the whole idea, right? Yes. That idea is the same idea behind people saying that Indian astrology comes from Greece. It's this whole idea that India does not have its own, ancient knowledge, but that knowledge actually came from the outside. That whole idea actually has, some racist underpinnings. This is well explored by scholars, such as David Frawley, Georg Forstein, other people who have studied, these things very deeply. They put forward the idea that the whole Aryan invasion theory, as it's known, is basically, a racist notion, that these people were uncivilized and somebody from the Europeans from the outside came in and civilized them. That kind of idea. We see that it's all over history, But regardless of that fact, there is so much evidence now that show, all kinds of archaeological evidence uncovered in India, especially in Gujarat and other places, that show that the Aryan people were not anybody who existed outside of India, but they were in fact the same people who were establishing the Indus Valley civilization, that these are in fact the native peoples of India. So what we call, the Harappan civilization, the Indus Valley civilization, all these times, most ancient periods of time, that the whole notion that that was something from the outside is completely debunked at this point. And there's one book in particular I would recommend for people who really want to explore this idea, in depth and from a scholarly angle. There's a book called The Ancient Cradle of Civilization. And that explores the evidence behind all of this, in great detail. So, that's fundamental, the whole idea that India had its own, culture at that time, that was not something that came from the outside. That's core, because that kind of dispels this whole idea that we then see carries on in all kinds of ways, in astrology, philosophy, Yeah,
I think the question that if India had a culture by that time, like the time range we are talking is like 3000 BC or something like that. So I think that question itself is void. So so there is no point to that question, because it is quite relevant and quite clear that Indians had a civilization going even then. And let's just move ahead in terms of how Greeks began their civilization and how it started. So I think I don't know, but I think I can trace back the Greek civilization, and I have read the Greek civilization like only from 800 BC or 700 BC, and slowly coming back to the Pythagoras era of the 6th and 5th century BC. So is there something before that we are actually missing?
Not that I'm aware of,
Okay. So
not that I'm aware of. I mean, the point is that the Indus Valley civilization is the oldest civilization, in the history of humankind.
Okay, so that pretty much
that settles it, right?
Yeah, I think that seals the point. There is no further exploring into that, because Indus Valley civilization, I think the basic history that we all read, even in primary school, kind of preaches that Indus Valley civilization is the oldest form of civilization. But and the other proof to that is I read a book, or not a book, but a research paper which had the astronomical symbols and the planetary glyphs, not exactly to what it is, what we have today, but still there were astronomical symbols and signs to prove that people have been viewing astronomy and astrology as a major science even during the 3000 and 2000 BC periods. So it's quite clear that we had something going, that, as you said before, that was rightly pointed out in terms of saying that we don't have textual evidence to prove everything, because textual kind of recording came far later in human era. So, but still we had a lot more going before that. So, would you like to comment on that, the astronomical evidences that we had before? And there is also Dr. David Frawley gave so many links and slokas from Rig Veda to attest to the fact that we had astrology also during that period itself, astrology and astronomy, but still we don't have anything today. We do have the Vedas, but still we don't have any astronomical texts from the before Common Era period itself. So what could be some of the reasons? And I'm sure some of them were lost in transmission, just like the Greeks kind of recorded their philosophies from 600 BC and then so on, because we have the Pythagoras era, like we still have evidence, and Pythagoras is some of the mathematical stuff we still have today. And we also have the materials of Greek philosophies like Socrates, Plato, Aristotle, and so on. We have so many philosophers, and we have scientists, and we have astronomers, and we also have astrologers, and Hellenistic astrology has just been in the revival process today. But still, do you think India also has some kind of text that goes before Common Era. I'm sure the likes of Manusmriti and Ardhashastra are one of the major evidences to prove that we have textual evidences that could date back to 300 or 400 BC. So I would really like to hear what you have to say on this.
Yeah, I think this whole issue of textual evidence is problematic in a lot of ways, because it ignores one reality, which is that astrology has existed since prehistory. So all the people who are writing these texts, they are already informed by an astrological worldview, and one only needs to read the Vedas to find this out very clearly. Yeah. All their rituals, everything that they're talking about is based on astrological principles. They're very clear about it and very, very serious about it. Their rituals depend upon the alignment to the heavens. Okay, that's the whole point. So whether or not they make a separate text that's like, this is what astrology is, that's irrelevant, because see, in that time, they weren't looking at it as like a separate science, a separate thing to codify. It was simply a seamless part of their life, their worldview, their religious practice. It was just one thing. It didn't appear as something to then articulate apart from what they were doing. Their way of articulating astrology is basically in the Vedas. I think the Vedas are full of examples for this. Rig Veda in particular.
Yeah, sure.
We don't find natal astrology in the Vedas and so forth, so that becomes another argument. But exactly. We do find very clear evidence that these people were aware of astrology, of astronomy. They were using those principles. They describe rashis as divisions of a circle, 30-degree divisions of a circle. That's very clear. They don't give it names, but they describe what the rashi is, basically.
And that's basically zodiac.
Yeah, that's the zodiac, right? And there's no doubt we are using Greek names. I'm not arguing at all that there has not been Greek influence. Okay? Yeah. Absolutely there has been. Absolutely, yes. There's been an exchange of knowledge on both sides there. But the point is, where did it all originate from? And to me, that's very clear that that's India. That's just a historical fact. And I'm not just saying that because we're both Indian. People might think it's funny, like we're Indians. Here we are preaching about the origins of Indian astrology. But I have no problem, with the idea that, it all came from Greece. If it did, that's fine.
Yes, exactly.
That's just not the fact in this case.
Yes, even I kind of, I'm not kind of agitated towards the fact that we have imported some astrological and astronomical stuff from Greece. That's fine, because at the end of the day, cross-pollination makes our science and technology even more viable to that particular era we are currently talking about. So there have been this kind of knowledge transmission in all the fields, and I kind of read a very interesting piece of history which I've quoted, but I've not published that particular article as of now. But the Pandya dynasty from the southern India had its capital city called Korkai, which is currently called as the city of Tuticorin or Thoothukudi. So that is the actual capital city of the Pandya dynasty, and the early Pandya dynasty kind of began at the end of 5th century BC, and then it kind of started slowly developing. So as and when it developed, there were so many Greek travelers that came to India and kind of had some, they kind of imported some of the knowledge that we had at that particular point of time. But I think their major motive was basically to come here for trade, because black pepper was always a very major commodity that people outside India were actually very highly interested in. So people came here for black pepper trade and other trade related activities, but still they were kind of largely influenced and surprised by the knowledge that Indians had at that particular point of time. And Megasthenes in his book mentioned that India had a far more developed and flourishing civilization, and also an open-minded civilization that Greeks had then, because there was no slavery in India. So that was the point that Megasthenes was making. So I don't see it as like entirely relevant to what we are talking today. but still I can find that there are Greek historians from the before Common Era. I think Megasthenes is from 4th century BC. So
Mhm.
we have Greek travelers coming to India and Greek traders coming to India and getting surprised by what we had then. So that must have probably been the starting point for the cultural and knowledge transmission that we are talking about. It could be from it could have been from Greece to India later on, but still, as it is, let it be. It's good. And people say that Yavana Jataka is entirely not entirely, but we have a lot of Greek stuff imported in Yamana Jataka, but most of what I've read in Yamana Jataka is mostly Indian, and I really see very less Greek influence. But there are a few things that we can consider as Greek influence, and there are other textual errors that have been made as well, which have been very actively discussing with Lars and Roke, my friends. So
Right.
there are so many problems that Vedic astrology has at this point of time, especially related to aspect doctrine. And Yavana Jataka kind of gives us clear proof. Yavana Jataka is probably the richest text that we have in astrology, one of the most richest texts. There is no argument related to that. But still, the cultural transmission, was it only from Greece to India, or it was from India to Greece as well? That's what we are exploring today. So I think we have already ventured so far in establishing that we had a very flourishing civilization going about even before the Common Era and even at 2000 and 1000 BC. So how do you see the knowledge transmission from the before Common Era to Common Era and until the 4th or 5th century AD and Varaha Mihira's period? Varaha Mihira's period is probably one of the most significant historical points from astrological and also astronomical knowledge transmission or knowledge establishment especially from Indian point of view.
That's right. And well, I think you're right to mention about the trade routes between Greece and India, because trade routes have always been the way that cultural cross-pollination has happened.
Yeah, that was the only reason why people would travel.
Exactly. That's the only reason. And that's how they end up finding out that, oh, these cultures have something interesting. You know, there's usually a good of some kind that they're after. But that becomes a channel of cultural communication. And that's very much true between Greece and India. And in fact, one of the primary evidences for their interaction. And, you know, I think it's simple. If you look at a lot of Greek philosophy, like if you look at Plato, if you look at even their medical philosophy, where they talk about 3 humors and things like that, you know, the humor, their notion of humors is coming entirely from Ayurveda. And that's not a debatable fact, you know. That is just absolutely the case. And also, if you look at Plato's philosophy, it's very much a non-dualistic philosophy. You know, it's very much like Advaita, you know?
Yeah, Please go on.
So, you know, it's very clear that the Greeks were highly influenced by Indian medicine and Indian astrology. You know, and that's not to say they were not already astronomers and so forth. They were probably exploring these things simultaneous in a lot of ways since the beginning of their civilization, which we know was later than Indian civilization. But they were drawing upon what they found in India. You know, they were not looking at these things until Indians had already looked at it, discussed it, you know. Yeah. And then they passed it on to the Greeks, and the Greeks had their own, you know, way of looking at that. And then they passed that back to the Indians, you know. And Yavana Jataka is an interesting text because it appears to acknowledge, you know, within the text that this is, you know, a lot of this comes from the Greeks and so forth. You know, it's like, you know, the Yavanas are considered to be the Greeks, a reference to the Greeks, right? You know, and it's a confusing text in a lot of ways because it contains so many Indian astrological principles.
Exactly.
You know, while also acknowledging some Greek influence, right? And you have scholars like David Pingree, whose translation of it has, you know, is basically the translation that exists. And he was a huge proponent of this idea that all Indian astrological knowledge came from Greece. And there's a Chinese scholar, you know, I can't remember his name in this very moment, but I'll look it up.
Sure.
And he has examined the Yavana Jataka and several other, you know, astrological texts of India, China, particularly India and China, and some of Greece. But he's particularly looked at Yavana Jataka and found, some missing parts of it, and retranslated that and pointed out areas where David Pingree's translation was not correct, where he did not decipher, the original manuscript properly. Okay. And he points out various, flaws with David Pingree's, understanding and so forth. Scholarship is a constantly evolving field, and what some scholars have said in the past is not necessarily completely true, and they tend to inject their bias into their translations, which is problematic.
Yeah, that's always there.
Yeah, that's always there. So, Yavana Jataka is the most interesting text because it shows the India-Greece connection, but it does not show that all Indian knowledge comes from Greece by any means, It's a respectful text that acknowledges Greek influence, and you'll see, if you look at Tibetan texts, you'll see that it's a common tradition for cultures to acknowledge the cross-cultural significance, of their knowledge. Like in Tibetan texts, they often will give the full Sanskrit name of the text, and then they'll give the Tibetan as a way of like paying homage to the fact that this came from India. We're acknowledging that this came from India and that we're building upon it, like they do that all the time, and Tibetan medicine, for example, is not at all shy about the fact that it has basically synthesized Ayurveda, indigenous Tibetan shamanic medicine, and Greek, and, it has a lot of Greek influence as well.
Okay.
Very clear about that. So it's a very common textual practice to acknowledge that this came from another place, and we're acknowledging their influence, but it shouldn't be taken to mean that, all of this came from somewhere else. Not at all.
Yeah. And the attribution that you said very rightly, I think the Greeks never had the attribution as it is. Varaha Mihira in his Brihat Samhita had mentioned that even though Greeks were barbarians, they were very good in terms of perfecting this science, and he referred to astrology. So that was the attribution that Varaha Mihira gave to the Greeks, and that is a very magnanimous gesture. And I think that was a very common gesture at that particular point of time. And today that man has become so greedy that people have started kind of attributing things to their own self or their own lands, and not attributing it to the actual original place from where it comes from. So, and people were very cool in terms of admitting that this particular tradition came from this particular region. So if we take the annual profections technique in Hellenistic astrology, it has a lot of relation to the Sudarshan Chakra that we have in Vedic astrology. So, so the profection stuff and things, I think it has a little bit of base. But again, we never know when Sudarshan Chakra came, and that becomes a problem. That becomes a very...
It's very difficult to trace like techniques like that.
Exactly.
Very difficult.
Yes, and I'm probably very sure that the astrologers of the early Common Era that existed in India, so I'm sure astrologers existed in India, but still I'm also pretty sure that they would have known how to interpret and use Sudarshan Chakra based upon the planetary positions in the Sudarshan Chakra. So that might have actually proved to be one of the basic foundations of the timing technique that I just mentioned about from Hellenistic astrology, which is annual profections. But the problem is that we are never sure about when Sudarshan Chakra was there, because people are kind of very, they're kind of obsessed with the date and the origins, and they want to trace it and they want to attribute something to this particular place. So that is where the debate and the ugly conversations and arguments arise, and we are kind of split today. But still, I think I'm very happy to see the millennials kind of pulling things together and trying to keep things universal and not attributing it to one particular place or region. So what are your thoughts on that? Like people attributing, especially Varaha Mihira gave a very good hint in terms of the fact that we have some Greek influence, and no one in India has a problem that we have a Greek influence. Maybe some people might, but still I'm sure no one is even worried about it.
Yeah, I think there couldn't be anything more universal than astrology. You
Exactly.
know, it is the most universal thing, and it teaches us that there is a unity, you know, in the very fabric of the cosmos.
Hmm.
So to be practicing astrology or studying astrology and then to be, you know, getting lost in these kinds of petty divisions is to entirely lose the essence of the science, in my opinion.
Okay.
And I think that those kinds of, you know, to make differences and to draw divides and things is completely irrelevant to the practice of astrology. And the root of all of these conflicts is really political, you know. The only reason why people are trying to establish, you know, the supremacy of one place over the other, or this place as where this came from, is for political reasons, social and political reasons, not for it doesn't have anything to do with knowledge, in fact, you know. Because the fact is, the knowledge that we have is the knowledge we have, and in a way it doesn't even matter where it came from. It's just what it is now, right? It doesn't change it to know where it came from. It's still what it is, you know.
Sure.
But it's interesting to consider these things, and I think that the consideration of these things should promote a universality, you know, because you see that in olden times, people were not like that. They were open about their influences, and they felt it to be positive to be engaged in cultural cross-pollination. You know, that was not seen as a lesser thing or problematic thing. It was embraced, you know. People were inspired by other forms of knowledge. It was exciting to them, you know.
Exactly.
So it should be equally exciting to us and interesting to us, you know. So there's no need to promote, you know, the idea that, oh, you know, all of this came from one place, you know. The astrology of the modern era is now a complete melting pot of so many influences, you know. But the origin of it is India. There's no doubt about that. It's simply the most ancient civilization, you know. Astrology comes from India, no doubt. But it has evolved, you know, in conversation with, you know, all kinds of cultures. Like what we're looking at today is so much more than what was in Rig Veda, you know. Like as you said at the beginning of this conversation, the most ancient form of astrology was nakshatra based.
Yeah.
That
Nakshatra.
was primarily what they were up to.
Yes. Yeah. Maybe. But still, the academicians are kind of obsessed with the paper-based facts, and that is something we cannot provide or acknowledge at this point of time. And we are about 3,000 and 4,000 years ahead in 2019.
Exactly.
So you mentioned a very interesting point about Plato kind of like being influenced by some of the Indian texts, especially medicine and philosophy. Do you have some other references in terms of how Greek philosophy was influenced by Indian? And I read something yesterday from a book but I'm unable to recollect the actual thing. So it would be great if you can say some of the points or some of the places where the Greek philosophers, ancient Greek philosophers, were influenced by Indian culture and knowledge.
Well, I see this in three areas.
Okay.
One is obviously in medicine.
Okay.
Second is in philosophy / astrology as well, obviously.
Okay.
And the third is in mathematics.
Oh,
okay.
great.
I think that there's a lot of evidence, you know, to show that a lot of what the Greeks were very innovative. You know, the Greeks are just in a way almost as famous as Indians when it comes to their philosophy, when it comes to their, you know, mathematical advances and paradigms, and of course astrology, right?
Yeah, sure.
In medicine too, they had some very interesting medical paradigms, and they were obviously, you know, there's some very famous Greeks like Galen, for example, Hippocrates. These people were already promoting at that time that astrology and medicine should be practiced together. You know, where do you think that idea came from? You know, what about the fact that Rig Veda already mentions astrological paradigms, and then later Atharva Veda basically is the root of Ayurveda?
Yeah.
You know? That's interesting, right? I mean, that predates Greece by far.
Okay, so yes, I think Ayurveda and Atharvana Veda can probably establish so many points that we are actually discussing here.
Yeah. Basically, what we're discussing here is all in the four Vedas, you could say, you know, basic. Sure. And that, of course, evolved philosophically in the Upanishads and those things. That's where you find, you know, non-dualism, Vedanta, and all that. That was also very influential to the Greeks. And Plato, if you study Plato's philosophy, you will see a lot of Vedantic notions there's no doubt, that he was influenced. I'm not saying that he didn't reach his own conclusions based on his own intuitions of things as well. I think that he very much did, and he put
Yeah,
it in his own words.
exactly.
He
Yes.
talking about things, a world of archetypes, ideal forms, all those things. The way that he talked about it was in very much a Greek way, but the root of those ideas is coming out of Vedanta.
Great. Yeah.
And, also, if you look at Vedic mathematics, another very fascinating area, one that I haven't, delved into very much, but, like Indians are credited as being the first to come up with the idea of zero, and other similar notions, like math was very much like, these are the foundation sciences of our culture, the things I just mentioned, and it's only natural that India is kind of a pioneer only because they were the oldest civilization. That's why, they are the pioneers in these sciences and domains of knowledge. And, the Greeks ran with it. It almost appears as though the Greeks were among the first like major civilizations to have significant contact and cultural transmission with the Indians, because they like ran with this knowledge and developed it like so nicely, articulated it so well. There's no doubt about it. I mean, their ability to take that influence and put it in their own words and come up with all kinds of new concepts is really fascinating,
Sure.
And so I think there's no doubt the examination of like the details of those transmission and like the details of those paradigms and how they went back and forth and how we can trace that is really well explored, is a whole huge topic. But if people want to find out what those connections are from a scholarly point of view, with historical evidence and so forth, they should study the book, The Shape of Ancient Thought, which is, as far as I've come across, the only book that explores, that is a comparative study of Greek and Indian culture and philosophy. And that book demonstrates all of these connections, very beautifully.
Okay, is this the book that you were talking about? Like we discussed it before a month or two. Like I think that was the starting point for this conversation. So, yeah, and I think we are almost reaching the end of this session, and we'll probably explore some of the more specific aspects in terms of like philosophical transmissions from India to Greece, with little more evidences and examples by quoting some of the philosophies from Greek. But still, I think we also have some more areas to explore in terms of establishing the history and the rich tradition of India in terms of Ayurveda and astrology. So I think linking Ayurveda and astrology and the quality of medicinal science that Indians had at that particular point of time is something that I would really like to talk with you some other time very soon. So do you have some final thoughts on this, or like we're done?
Yeah, I think, all of these areas can be explored, in great depth. And, we can also produce, citations and quote from texts and things like that we can also explore it in detail that way too. If we took like one topic at a time and just fleshed it out, this is kind of an overview. I'm just giving an overview and just giving a summary, of where these things really stand, and that there's all these interactions, very complex, by the way, these interactions, and very deep. And I think it's a wonderful thing that there has been these interactions, and, it's just a matter of appreciating diversity in culture and diversity in our astrological knowledge, because, in Vedic astrology is now so many things. Hellenistic astrology is having a revival. Vedic astrology is having a revival. It's inevitable that now there's going to be some exchange of techniques. In fact, these conversations are already happening.
Yeah, even I think I'm a living example of what you're talking about, because I'm entirely into Hellenistic astrology at this point of time, because I think I'm finding the gaps. I'm kind of finding the fillers that I had gaps before, and it is one of the most fascinating astrological traditions that we can actually link to Vedic astrology. And Lars always used to say that Vedic and Hellenistic are always the sister traditions, and it is always great to practice it together. So I'm sure that the astrologers of the antiquity also kind of had a similar idea. which is why there has been a lot of astrological transmission during that period. So I think we'll explore this further with a lot of specificities and quotations or citations, as you said. And I think this is just an overview of what we are probably going to do in near future. So
Definitely.
yeah. So where can people find out your works? And I think you also have a YouTube channel.
Yes, my website is atmaastrology.com.
Okay.
atmaastrology.com, and that's where basically everything is. My YouTube channel is youtube.com/c/atmaastrology, or you can just search for Atma Astrology on YouTube. You'll find me.
Sure, that's great. And yeah, until we get back next time, we'll just say bye.
Yeah, thanks for having me, Aswin.
Thank you.